They were richer than kings, feared by emperors, and their word was more reliable than gold. They were the Knights Templar, the most powerful and mysterious brotherhood in history. But on one fateful Friday the 13th, their empire fell. The knights were thrown into prisons and tortured, and their legendary treasures disappeared without a trace. Where did the treasure that could buy entire kingdoms go? Was it gold, priceless relics, or secret knowledge capable of turning the world upside down? 700 years later, the hunt continues. In this video, we will follow in the footsteps of the greatest mystery in history. The story we are about to tell does not begin with mountains of gold or secret conspiracies, but with dust, blood, and unshakable faith. To understand the origins of the greatest mystery of the Middle Ages, we must travel back 9 centuries to the heart of the war-torn Holy Land. The year was 1119. Only 2 decades had passed since the First Crusade ended with the capture of Jerusalem. The Christian world rejoiced, and thousands of pilgrims, from simple peasants to noble lords, flocked to the Holy Sepulchre. But their journey was a road of sorrow. The journey from coastal ports such as Jaffa, deep into the country, to the holy walls of Jerusalem, turned into a deadly lottery. The roads that ran through desert gorges and rocky passes were infested with bands of robbers and flying squads of Saracens. Pilgrims, unarmed and exhausted from the long sea crossing, were easy prey. They were robbed, killed, and taken into slavery. For many, the dream of worshipping the holy sites ended on the last, most dangerous stretch of the journey. The chronicles of that time are full of heart-rending accounts of the massacres and suffering that prevailed on the roads of Palestine. It was in this atmosphere of universal fear and despair that a modest figure, destined to change the world, entered the historical scene. His name was Hugo de Payens, a French nobleman from Champagne and a veteran of the First Crusade. He witnessed the horrors unfolding on the roads with his own eyes, and his heart, as a knight and a Christian, could not remain indifferent. Together with 8 of his comrades, equally noble and impoverished knights, he made a fateful decision. They appeared before Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, and swore an oath to devote their lives to protecting pilgrims. They took 3 monastic vows: poverty, obedience, and chastity. But unlike monks, their monastery was the dusty road, and their prayer was the clang of swords defending the innocent. Their official name was imbued with humility: Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. At first, the people simply called them Poor Knights. They had neither land nor wealth. Legend has it that 2 knights shared a single horse. This image, captured on their seal, became an eternal symbol of their original poverty and brotherhood. King Baldwin, impressed by their selflessness, granted them royal mercy. He gave them an entire wing of his palace as their headquarters, which was believed to be located on the ruins of the legendary Temple of Solomon on Temple Mount. It was from this place that their famous name, which would resound throughout the world, originated: the Templars, or the Knights Templar. The first years of their existence were incredibly difficult. 9 knights against hundreds of bandits. They lived on donations, wore patched clothes, and fought, risking everything. But their courage and noble mission began to bear fruit. Rumors of fearless warrior monks spread throughout the Holy Land and reached Europe. However, for the order to develop fully, it needed official recognition from the Church. Here, one of the most influential people of the time, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a passionate preacher and theologian, played a key role. The nephew of one of the founding knights, he was inspired by the idea of a new, unique order and became its main lobbyist. He wrote a treatise entitled In Praise of the New Knighthood, in which he extolled the Templars as ideal warriors of Christ, combining monastic humility with martial valor. His passionate speeches and authority did the trick. In January 1129, at a church council in Troyes, the Order of the Temple was officially recognized by the Holy See. They were granted their own charter, exempted from taxes, and placed directly under the authority of the Pope, removing them from the jurisdiction of local bishops and secular rulers. As a distinctive sign, they were granted white robes, a symbol of purity and chastity. The red cross, which became their trademark, appeared on their cloaks a little later. From that moment on, the history of the poor knights came to an end. The history of the powerful order of the Knights Templar began. A military, financial, and political force unmatched in Europe. A legend was born. With papal blessing and official status, the Order of the Knights Templar began to grow rapidly. From a handful of enthusiasts, it turned into a sprawling international organization. Throughout Europe, from England to Spain, commanderies, local chapters of the order, began to spring up like mushrooms after rain. Young nobles, inspired by the idea of serving Christ with a sword in their hands, joined its ranks en masse. They brought their lands, castles, and property as gifts to the order, since one of the main conditions for admission was a vow of poverty. Everything personal became communal. This system of donations became the first trickle in the river of gold that would soon flow into the coffers of the Templars. However, their original mission, to protect pilgrims, was not only not forgotten, but also reached a whole new level. The Templars created the first truly effective road safety system in history. Their patrols became a terror to bandits, and the fortresses built along key routes served as reliable refuges for travelers. But it was here, in the course of fulfilling their main task, that the knights encountered a new problem. Pilgrims embarking on long and dangerous journeys were forced to carry large sums of money in gold and silver coins. This made them prime targets for robbers. Even under the protection of the Templars, the risk remained enormous. And then the Templars made a brilliant financial discovery that was centuries ahead of its time. They invented a system that we would today call a system of traveler's checks, or bank transfers. The principle was strikingly simple and effective. A pilgrim in London, for example, could go to the local Templar commandery, deposit his money for safekeeping, and receive a special certificate in return. This certificate, stamped and encrypted with a special code, indicated the amount deposited. With this document, the traveler could set off on his journey without fear of robbers. Upon reaching the Holy Land, he presented his certificate to the order's branch in Jerusalem and received his money back in local currency, minus a small commission for services. This system revolutionized medieval travel and finance. For the first time in history, a safe way to move capital over huge distances was created. In fact, the Knights Templar created the world's first international banking network. Their commanderies, scattered throughout Europe and the Middle East, acted as branches of a single bank. They not only accepted deposits and made transfers, but also began to engage in lending. Kings and noble lords who needed money to wage wars or build castles increasingly turned to the Templars for loans rather than traditional moneylenders. The Knights Templar were reliable lenders. They did not cheat, offered reasonable interest rates, formally considered compensation for risk in order to circumvent the Church's ban on usury, and had sufficient resources to lend huge sums. Their reputation was impeccable. Moreover, the order began to act as treasurer for many monarchs, and even for the papal throne. The Paris Temple, the order's main residence in France, became the financial center of the entire kingdom. The royal treasury was kept here, and major financial transactions were carried out here. The Templars managed the property of widows and orphans, acted as executors, and collected taxes. From poor knights sharing a single horse, they became the most influential and skilled financiers of their time. Their transformation was remarkable. Warrior monks who had taken a vow of poverty became administrators of untold wealth, creating a system that laid the foundations of modern banking. They no longer simply guarded the roads, they became the guardians of the economy of the entire Christian world. The financial system created by the Templars was ingenious, but it was only one of the sources of their fabulous wealth. The order's treasury was replenished from many streams, which over time merged into a full-flowing river of gold capable of flooding entire kingdoms. The first and most important source was donations. In an era when faith was the backbone of life and the salvation of the soul was the main goal, supporting the Holy Order, which shed blood for the Holy Sepulchre, was considered a matter of paramount importance. The European aristocracy, from minor barons to powerful dukes and kings, generously endowed the monks. They donated land, forests, villages with peasants, castles, mills, vineyards, and even entire cities. This was often done in exchange for prayers for the repose of souls or in the hope of the order's intercession. Every such gift, large or small, brought income. The land was leased or cultivated by the order, producing crops that were sold. Mills and wineries generated stable profits. As a result, by the end of the 13th century, the Knights Templar had become the largest landowner in Europe. Their possessions stretched from Scotland to Sicily, from Portugal to Hungary. It was a veritable empire within an empire, a state without clear borders, but with thousands of strongholds. The second most powerful source of income was commercial activity. Thanks to their special status and direct subordination to the Pope, the Templars were exempt from all local taxes, duties, and fees. This gave them a huge competitive advantage. They could transport goods across borders without paying customs duties, which ruined ordinary merchants. The order built its own fleet, one of the largest in the Mediterranean. Their ships, with red crosses on white sails, not only transported pilgrims and crusaders, but also engaged in active trade. They imported spices, silk, and other luxury items from the East, and transported European goods such as wool, metals, and timber in the opposite direction. Their port facilities, such as those in La Rochelle and Marseille, were the most modern and well-equipped. The third, and perhaps most controversial source of wealth, was usury, or, as it was delicately called, lending. The Church officially condemned the charging of interest, but the Templars found a way to circumvent this prohibition. They issued loans for risk compensation, or drew them up as lease agreements with subsequent redemption. Their clients were the most influential people in Europe. King John of England kept the royal regalia in the London Temple. The kings of France, starting with Louis VII, constantly borrowed huge sums from the order to finance wars and state needs. Even the Pope did not disdain the financial services of the Templars. The order became a universal bank for the entire European elite. Wealth begat even greater wealth. Capital that was not used for lending or trade was invested in construction and the acquisition of new property. Their castles and commanderies were not just military bases, but highly profitable agricultural and craft centers. By the beginning of the 14th century, the order's power seemed limitless. According to various estimates, they owned about 10,000 properties throughout Europe. Their annual income exceeded that of the largest European monarchies. They possessed untold reserves of gold and silver, stored in their main treasuries in Paris and London. These were the most secure and inaccessible repositories of their time. Legends about the treasures of the Templars stirred the imagination of their contemporaries. There was talk of golden statues, precious stones the size of pigeon eggs, secret knowledge, and sacred relics that were more valuable than any gold. But behind the glitz of this wealth lay a deadly danger. The order's independence, its enormous influence, and financial power inspired not only respect, but also dark envy, especially among those who owed them the most. At the center of the web that began to form around the Knights Templar stood one man. His name was Philip IV, King of France. His contemporaries called him Philip the Fair because of his stately figure and regular features. But behind this attractive appearance lay a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless nature. Philip was an atypical monarch for his time. He had little interest in jousting, feasting, or hunting. He devoted all his energy to achieving a single goal: building an absolute centralized monarchy where the will of the king was the supreme law, standing above everyone, including the church and the feudal nobility. He was obsessed with the idea of France's greatness and his own unlimited power. However, his grandiose plans required enormous resources. The French royal treasury was chronically empty. Philip waged protracted and costly wars with his main rivals, England and the wealthy cities of Flanders. The army had to be maintained, mercenaries had to be paid, and the bureaucracy, which was growing rapidly, required constant injections of funds. The king was desperately looking for money. He tried all the methods available to him. He repeatedly debased the currency, reducing its precious metal content, which led to inflation and popular discontent. In 1306, he expelled all Jews from the country, confiscating their property and forgiving all debts owed to them by the crown. Soon, the same fate befell Lombard bankers. These were effective but short-term measures that undermined the economy and reputation of the kingdom. But there was one creditor who could not be dealt with so easily. That creditor was the Order of the Knights Templar. Over the decades, the French crown had accumulated an astronomical debt to the Templars. The sum was so large that Philip had no chance of ever paying it off. The situation was humiliating. The king, who considered himself God's representative on earth, was up to his ears in debt to a military monastic order that was formally his subject, but in reality behaved like an independent state. The Parisian Temple, an impregnable fortress in the heart of his capital, served not only as the order's main treasury, but, ironically, as the repository of the royal treasury. Philip was forced to turn to the knight bankers for every coin, report to them, and endure their control. For a man with his ambitions and his conception of power, this was unbearable. But it was not just about money. The Templars were a thorn in Philip's side. They represented everything he fought against. They were a state within a state. They had their own laws, their own courts. They did not pay taxes to the royal treasury and were subject only to the distant pope. Their castles and lands were scattered throughout France, but did not belong to the crown. Their military power and international connections made them a force to be reckoned with. In the eyes of Philip the Fair, the builder of an absolutist state, the Order of the Knights Templar was an anomaly, a dangerous remnant of the past that had to be eliminated. He saw them not as saviors of the Holy Sepulchre, but as insolent creditors and dangerous rivals for power. And gradually, a monstrous plan began to take shape in his cold and calculating mind. A plan that would allow him to solve all his problems with one blow, get rid of an unimaginable debt, seize the legendary treasures of the Order, and destroy the last force standing in the way of his absolute power. Envy, fear, and political calculation merged into a volatile mixture ready to explode. The king in debt was preparing to become the king executioner. King Philip the Fair was a master of political intrigue, but even he needed loyal and unprincipled executors to carry out such a daring and ambitious plan as the destruction of an entire order. And he had such a man, his right-hand man, keeper of the seal and chief advisor, Guillaume de Nogaret. Nogaret was the complete opposite of his king. Short, unattractive, he possessed neither beauty nor aristocratic origins. He was a lawyer from the lower nobility who made his career solely through his sharp mind, incredible work ethic, and complete lack of moral scruples. For him, as for Philip, the greatness of the state was paramount, and any means to achieve this goal were acceptable. Moreover, Nogaret had a personal score to settle with the church. His grandfather had been burned at the stake as a Cathar heretic, and this family trauma, according to many historians, fueled his hatred of any independent religious institutions. It was Nogaret who became the chief architect of the conspiracy against the Templars. He was the mastermind behind the entire operation, the man who turned the king's vague desires into a clear and deadly plan of action. The work began long before the fateful Black Friday. For several years, Nogaret's agents throughout France secretly gathered compromising information on the order. They sought out malcontents, former knights expelled for disciplinary reasons, or servants harboring grudges against their masters. These people were promised money, forgiveness for their past sins, and royal protection in exchange for correct testimony. Gradually, bit by bit, a database of false testimony was created. The main emphasis was on accusations of heresy and blasphemy, since only such crimes could justify an attack on an order under the personal protection of the Pope. Specially hired witnesses told horrific stories about the secret rituals of the Templars. Allegedly, upon joining the order, new recruits were forced to renounce Christ 3 times, spit on the crucifix, and worship a certain idol, a bearded head named Baphomet. Added to this were accusations of sodomy, infanticide, and financial fraud. All this was dirty slander, but Nogaret knew that if a lie is repeated 1,000 times from the highest platforms, it begins to seem true. Parallel to the fabrication of evidence, a subtle diplomatic game was being played. The key figure in it was Pope Clement V. He was French, a former Archbishop of Bordeaux, and owed his election to the papal throne largely to the support of Philip the Fair. The Pope was a weak and indecisive man, effectively held captive by the French king, who had moved his residence from Rome to Avignon. Philip and Nogaret exerted enormous pressure on him, flooding him with denunciations of the Templars and demanding that he launch an official investigation. The Pope hesitated, unable to believe in the guilt of an order that had served the Church faithfully for almost 2 centuries. But he did not dare to go against his powerful patron. The culmination of the preparatory phase was the development of a plan unprecedented in its audacity and secrecy. Nogaret realized that attacking the order gradually would give it time to mobilize, organize its defense, and remove its treasures. The blow had to be simultaneous, sudden, and total. Secret packages were sent throughout France to royal officials, seneschals, and bailiffs. They contained detailed orders. On the same day, at dawn, to arrest all Templars without exception in their territory, seize all their property, and seal all documents. The packets were strictly forbidden to be opened before a certain date specified in them. The date chosen was the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307. The web was woven. Every thread was in place. All that remained was to wait for the right moment to slam the trap shut with one swift movement. The full power of the state apparatus was focused on the unsuspecting victim. Dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, was no different from hundreds of other autumn dawns. A cold fog hung over the Seine, and the first rays of the sun timidly pierced through the stained glass windows of the cathedrals. In the commanderies of the Knights Templar throughout France, life went on as usual. The warrior monks woke up before dawn for morning prayers, servants prepared a modest breakfast, and squires cleaned their armor. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, an elderly and respected veteran of countless battles in the East, was in the order's main citadel, the Parisian Temple. He had arrived in France a few months earlier at the invitation of Pope Clement V to discuss the organization of a new crusade. Just a few days earlier, he had participated with honor in the funeral of the king's sister-in-law. he felt completely safe. But at the very moment when the Templars were praying, something sinister was happening throughout the kingdom. In the castles of the seneschals and in the houses of the city bailiffs, royal officials, obeying orders received earlier, opened secret packages sealed with the seal of Philip the Fair, with hands trembling with excitement. The contents of the orders were brief, clear, and monstrous. At first light, arrest all members of the Order of the Temple, from the Grand Master to the last servant. Confiscate all their property, lands, gold, and archives. Act quickly, decisively, and ruthlessly. And the state machine, fine-tuned by the genius of Nogaret, sprang into action with terrifying efficiency. Throughout France, from Paris to Marseille, from La Rochelle to Lyon, thousands of royal soldiers and sergeants simultaneously struck the gates of the Templar commanderies. The element of surprise was complete. The knights, caught off guard, many still in bed or in the chapel, offered virtually no resistance. It was not a battle, but a police operation. Skilled warriors who had faced death many times in battles with the Saracens surrendered without a single sword blow. Why? Because the order came from the King of France, their lord. Resistance would have meant open rebellion against the crown, a crime unthinkable for people whose lives were built on vows of obedience. They were convinced that some terrible misunderstanding had occurred, which would soon be resolved. They could not believe that the most Christian king could do such a thing. In the Parisian temple, the scene was particularly dramatic. Royal soldiers stormed the citadel, which was considered impregnable. 70-year-old Jacques de Molay and all the senior leadership of the order were arrested and put in chains. These heroes of the Christian world were dragged off to prison like common criminals. Within a few hours, the operation was complete. Thousands of Templars throughout France found themselves behind bars. Their fortresses were occupied and their treasuries sealed. The trap that Philip and Nogaret had so carefully and painstakingly prepared had sprung. The news of the arrests shocked all of Europe. No one could believe what was happening. An order that had been a bastion of Christianity for almost 200 years was suddenly declared a gathering of heretics and criminals. This event shook the consciousness of contemporaries so much that it left an indelible mark on European culture. It was on this day, Friday the 13th, that the superstition arose and took hold among the people that this combination of the day of the week and the number brings misfortune. Black Friday for the Templars became a black day for the entire era, marking the end of the world of the Crusades and the beginning of an era of cynical state calculations. The Great Order was decapitated and humiliated, but the main question that preoccupied King Philip remained unanswered. His men had seized castles, lands, and debt books, but where were the legendary treasures? Where were the mountains of gold that legends spoke of? Initial searches yielded nothing. The treasury was empty. With the arrest of the knights, the first and most daring part of Philip the Fair's plan had been carried out. But now the second, no less important and much dirtier stage began. Legitimizing this act of state banditry, it was necessary to prove to the entire Christian world that the Knights Templar were not victims of royal greed, but a malignant tumor on the body of the Church, a nest of heresy and vice, deserving of the most severe punishment. A process began that contemporaries would call the trial of the century. Formally, the case was handed over to the Holy Inquisition, which was supposed to give it the appearance of impartial ecclesiastical justice. However, this was only a facade. The French Inquisition at that time was completely controlled by the king, and its head was Guillaume de Paris, Philip's confessor. It was not a trial, but a well-staged spectacle in which the roles of executioners and victims were predetermined. The list of charges, painstakingly compiled by Guillaume de Nogaret, was long and monstrous. It consisted of 127 points, each of which was cleverly designed to shock, terrify, and disgust the devout medieval mind. The main points were: the first and most terrible was the renunciation of Jesus Christ. It was claimed that during a secret nighttime initiation ceremony, each recruit was forced to renounce the Savior 3 times and spit on the crucifix as a sign of complete contempt. The second was idolatry. The Templars were accused of worshipping a mysterious head, which investigators called Baphomet. It was described in various ways: as the head of a bearded man, as a skull with burning eyes, or as a 3-faced creature. This image was probably deliberately constructed to evoke associations with the devil and black magic, playing on the deepest fears of society. The third was sodomy and systematic debauchery. To completely destroy the reputation of a monastic order that had taken a vow of chastity, it was claimed that homosexual relations flourished within its walls. According to the accusers, the initiation ritual included the so-called osculum infame, a shameful kiss. The new recruit had to kiss his senior brother on the base of his spine, on his navel, and on his lips. The fourth charge was financial fraud, the murder of rebellious members of the order, and secret plots against Christian monarchs. To obtain evidence for these absurd accusations, the main instrument of medieval justice was used: torture. The arrested knights, heroes of countless battles, were thrown into the damp and cold dungeons of the royal prisons. They were starved, deprived of sleep, kept in complete isolation, and then handed over to the executioners. The methods were varied and devilishly cruel. Water torture, when a huge amount of liquid was poured into the victim's throat through a funnel, causing suffocation and rupture of internal organs. Suspension on the rack, when a person's joints were slowly twisted. But torture by fire was considered particularly effective. The interrogated person's legs were smeared with fat and held over a brazier, literally roasting their feet until the bones separated from the flesh. 36 knights died during these interrogations, never living to see their trial. Those who survived were physically and morally broken. In their delirium from pain and despair, they were ready to confess to anything to end the inhuman torture. They incriminated themselves, their brothers in the order, their mentors, confirming the wildest and most absurd fabrications of the investigators. Even Grand Master Jacques de Molay, an old and sick man, could not withstand several days of torture. He admitted to some of the charges, in particular renouncing Christ and spitting on the cross, although he added that he did so not with his heart, but only with his lips. His confession, extracted under torture, became the prosecution's trump card. The interrogation records, full of these heartfelt confessions, were immediately copied and sent to all the royal courts of Europe as irrefutable proof of the Templars' guilt. The truth no longer interested anyone. The machine of destruction set in motion by the king was gaining momentum and could no longer be stopped. The trial of the Templars dragged on for 7 long years. It was a painful and difficult period, filled with legal battles, diplomatic maneuvers, and human tragedies. Pope Clement V, under enormous pressure from Philip the Fair, tried to maneuver. He established his own papal commissions of inquiry, hoping to take control of the process. And for a while, it seemed that the Templars had a chance. When the knights were transferred from royal prisons to papal prisons and the torture ceased, many of them, including hundreds of knights in France, immediately recanted their confessions. They claimed that they had been forced to incriminate themselves and the order under unbearable torture, and that all the charges were vile slander. A defense was organized. Lawyers were hired to prove the illegality of the king's actions and the Inquisition. But Philip had no intention of backing down. In 1310, to intimidate the rest, the Archbishop of Sens, a king's henchman, sentenced 54 Templars, who refused to recant their confessions, to be burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. This brutal massacre broke the will to resist. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, a weakened and broken Pope Clement V, under direct pressure from King Philip, who even arrived at the council with an armed detachment, issued the bull Vox in excelso. In it, without passing a final judgment on the guilt or innocence of the order, he dissolved it by his supreme authority. The property of the Templars, with the exception of their possessions in Spain and Portugal, was transferred to their eternal rivals, the Order of Hospitallers. However, the Hospitallers received only a small portion. The lion's share, including huge compensation for the costs of the trial, went to the French crown. Philip got what he wanted. The fate of the order's highest-ranking members, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay and Prior of Normandy Geoffroy de Charny, remained undecided. Their case was to be reviewed by a special commission of cardinals. They languished in prison for 7 years, used as pawns in a great political game. And then, on March 18, 1314, the denouement came. A platform was erected on the steps of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. A huge crowd gathered to hear the final verdict. The 4 highest-ranking members of the order were brought out before the public. The cardinals read out the verdict. Based on their own previous confessions, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. And at that moment, something unexpected happened. An act of desperate courage took place that forever inscribed the name of the last Grand Master in history. As soon as the cardinal finished speaking, Jacques de Molay, a 70-year-old man exhausted by years of imprisonment, stepped forward and addressed the crowd in a loud, strong voice that could be heard by everyone in the square. He declared that the Order of the Temple was holy and pure, and that all the charges against it were lies. He said that he had confessed to crimes he did not commit only out of fear of cruel torture, and that he was ashamed of his weakness. He declared that he was ready to die to atone for this sin and defend the honor of his order. He was immediately supported by Geoffroy de Charny. The crowd froze in shock. King Philip, who was watching the scene from his palace, flew into a rage. This was a public challenge to his authority, undermining the entire 7-year process. The decision was made instantly and without trial. That same evening, on one of the islands of the Seine, which is now part of the Ile de la Cité, a huge bonfire was lit. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were tied to stakes. Legend has it that the Grand Master asked to be turned to face Notre Dame, and not to have his hands tied so that he could die in prayer. When the flames engulfed him, he did not utter a single cry. Before his death, according to the chronicles of the time, he raised his voice one last time and uttered his famous curse against his executioners. Pope Clement, King Philip, Guillaume de Nogaret, not a year will pass before I summon you to the judgment of God. Whether this curse was actually uttered or is a later legend, we do not know. But the facts are stubborn. Pope Clement V died of dysentery just a month after the execution, on April 20th. Guillaume de Nogaret, according to some sources, died before the execution of the magistrate. And King Philip the Fair fell from his horse while hunting in November of the same year and soon died from the effects of a stroke at the age of 46. The Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for more than 300 years, ended with his sons. The legend of the curse of the Grand Master became the last and most dramatic chapter in the history of the Knights Templar. The execution of Jacques de Molay put a bloody end to the history of the Knights Templar. King Philip the Fair could rejoice. His main enemy within the kingdom had been destroyed. His will had prevailed. And the dying Grand Master's curse seemed to him nothing more than the ravings of a dying man. Now came the most pleasant moment, receiving the reward. The indebted king was preparing to become a wealthy king. He anticipated how his treasury would be filled with the legendary gold of the Templars. Throughout the country, royal officials, financiers, and appraisers eagerly set to work. They opened treasure chambers, counted assets, and compiled detailed inventories of all confiscated property. And as the reports landed on the king's desk, his triumph was replaced first by bewilderment, then by cold fury. Something inexplicable was happening. Yes, the crown had gained a lot. Thousands of hectares of fertile land, hundreds of castles, farms, mills, and commanderies passed into Philip's hands. Debt notes for huge sums were seized, which were now owed not to the order, but to the king personally. It was a colossal acquisition that made the French monarchy even stronger. But it was not what he was looking for. Where was the gold? Where were the mountains of gold florins and silver dinars that all of Europe whispered about? Where were the chests filled with precious stones? Where were the sacred relics that, according to rumors, the temple guards had taken from Jerusalem? The answer was shocking. They were not there. The order's main treasury in the Parisian temple, which was considered the most reliable bank in the world, was practically empty. Of course, they found some silverware, church utensils, and small amounts of money intended for current expenses. But these were mere crumbs compared to the riches that, according to all estimates, should have been there. The order's income in France alone was many times greater than that of the king himself. Where did these huge financial flows, which had been pouring into Paris for decades, disappear to? Historians who have studied the surviving confiscation records confirm this striking fact. The total amount of liquid assets seized from the Templars was negligible. It did not even cover a small part of Philip's debt to the order. The result was absurd and humiliating for the king. He staged the trial of the century, trampled on all laws, and destroyed the most powerful organization. But in the end, he was left empty-handed. The main prize slipped right out of his hands. It was at this moment that the greatest mystery was born, one that continues to excite the minds of historians and treasure hunters to this day. Where did the Templars' treasures disappear to? And we are not just talking about gold and silver. Something else, perhaps even more valuable, disappeared along with them. The order's main archives disappeared. Only the accounting books and current documentation were found. But where did the secret reports, confidential correspondence, lists of all members of the order and their agents, and possibly compromising information on the most influential people in Europe go? Where did the Templar fleet go? Their main naval base was in the port of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast. It was a powerful fleet, capable of transporting thousands of people and tons of cargo. On the night before the arrests, according to some chroniclers, several ships loaded to the brim with unknown cargo secretly left the harbor and disappeared into the ocean. No one ever saw them again. All this pointed to the only possible conclusion. Someone had warned the Templars. Despite all the precautions taken by Nogaret, there had been a leak. The order had enough time, perhaps several days or even weeks, to organize the evacuation of its most valuable possessions. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, going to his certain death, may have been playing his last and most important game. He sacrificed himself and his French brothers to save the order's most important legacy and its secret. Philip's trap snapped shut, but the cage was empty. From that moment on, the hunt for the king turned into a hunt for a phantom treasure. The mystery of the empty Templar treasury and the sudden disappearance of the treasure has given rise to many theories that have stirred the imagination of researchers for 7 centuries. The first, most logical and most supported by circumstantial evidence version says that the treasure was taken by sea. The key to this hypothesis lies not in Paris, but hundreds of kilometers away, on the Atlantic coast of France, in the port city of La Rochelle. This port was no ordinary city. In the 13th century, it was the main naval and commercial base of the Knights Templar on the Atlantic. They enjoyed special privileges here, had their own docks, warehouses, and powerful fortifications. In fact, it was their own private, well-protected port, giving them direct access to the open ocean, bypassing the English Channel, which was controlled by the French crown. From here, their ships sailed to England, Flanders, and possibly much further. The Templar fleet was a source of particular pride and one of the pillars of their power. It was not only large, but also the most modern of its time. And so, when royal officials arrived in La Rochelle to carry out the order of arrest and confiscation, they were met with the same surprise as in the Parisian temple. The port was there, but the fleet was gone. Almost all of the order's large ships had disappeared. Local legends and later chronicles, although not always entirely reliable, paint an intriguing picture. Allegedly, on the night before the arrests, from October 12th to 13th, there was unusual activity in the port. Under cover of darkness, heavy boxes and chests were loaded onto several of the largest and fastest ships, known as nefs. The preceptor, superintendent, of La Rochelle personally commanded the loading. As soon as everything was ready, a squadron of 18 ships weighed anchor and silently slipped out of the harbor, heading west into the endless expanse of the Atlantic. No one ever saw them again. If this story is true, it explains a lot. It explains the empty treasury and the missing archives. Not only gold, silver, and jewels could have been loaded on board. Perhaps the Order's most important relics were also there, such as, according to one of the most popular versions, the Shroud of Turin. Most importantly, there could have been surviving knights, those who received a warning and managed to avoid the trap. But the main question remains, where did they go? Where could a fleet loaded with the world's greatest secret and wealth have gone? There were several possible destinations. The first and most obvious was Portugal. King Dinis I of Portugal was a wise and far-sighted ruler. He did not believe the accusations of Philip the Handsome and refused to persecute the Templars on his land. He understood the value of their knowledge, their combat experience, and their capital for the development of his kingdom. After the order was officially dissolved by the Pope, Dinis did not confiscate their property, but created a new, purely Portuguese Order of Christ, to which all former Templars transferred, along with their assets. The coat of arms of the new order was the same Templar cross. It is very likely that part of the fleet found refuge there, in friendly Portuguese harbors, contributing their wealth and knowledge to the new structure. The second possible destination was Scotland. This version is even more intriguing. In 1307, Scotland was at war with England for its independence. Its king, Robert Bruce, was excommunicated by the Pope for murdering his political rival in a church. This meant that papal bulls, including the one ordering the arrest of the Templars, had no legal force in Scotland. For fugitive knights who had been declared outlaws throughout Europe, Scotland was an ideal refuge. King Robert Bruce, desperately in need of experienced warriors and money to fight the English, welcomed the Templar fleet with open arms. The battle-hardened knights and their legendary wealth could have been the trump card that helped the Scots win the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The sea route is the most rational of all the versions. It explains how the treasure could have disappeared so quickly and without a trace. The ocean knows how to keep secrets. It swallowed ships with red crosses on their sails, leaving behind only waves of speculation and legends that continue to this day. If part of the Templar fleet did indeed set sail for the north, then Scotland was their most logical and safe destination. This mountainous, harsh country at the beginning of the 14th century was a veritable island of outcasts in the middle of Catholic Europe. Its king, Robert Bruce, was fighting a desperate war for independence against England and, most importantly, had been excommunicated by the Church. This made him and his kingdom immune to the orders of the Pope. For knights declared heretics, Scotland was an ideal refuge. Here they could not only be accepted, but also given protection in exchange for military assistance and financial support. And at the center of this theory is one of the most mysterious buildings in the world, Rosslyn Chapel, officially called St. Matthew's Collegiate Church. It is located a few miles south of Edinburgh. At first glance, there is one big but in its history. The chapel was built by Sir William Sinclair, 3rd Earl of Orkney, in the mid-15th century, almost 150 years after the destruction of the Knights Templar. How could it be connected to their treasures? According to proponents of this theory, the answer lies in the Sinclair family itself and in the chapel's incredible, unique architecture. The Sinclair clan, or St. Clairs, were of Norman origin and had long-standing close ties to the Knights Templar. Some historians claim that the founder of the Scottish branch of the clan was married to the sister of one of the founding knights of the order. The Sinclairs were well-known patrons of the Templars in Scotland, and their lands were located in close proximity to the main Scottish preceptory of the Knights Templar in Ballintrodoch. Legend has it that it was the Sinclair clan who gave refuge to the fugitive knights who arrived from the continent and became the keepers of their secrets, knowledge, and possibly part of their treasures. And Rosslyn Chapel, built by their descendant a century and a half later, became not just a church, but a stone book, an encrypted message, a repository of this secret. When you enter the chapel, it becomes clear that this is no ordinary religious building. Its interior is a veritable forest of stone. Every square inch of the walls, ceiling, and columns is covered with intricate, bizarre carvings. Christian scenes, pagan symbols, images of hundreds of mythical creatures and plant ornaments are intertwined here. Among these carvings, researchers find many symbols that are directly linked to the legacy of the Knights Templar and, later, the Freemasons. There are images of knights very similar to Templars, scenes reminiscent of initiation rituals, and numerous variations of Templar crosses. The two most famous columns, the Master's Column and the Apprentice's Column, resemble the pillars of Solomon's Temple in their symbolic meaning, which is a direct reference to the original name of the order. But the greatest mystery of Rosslyn is the so-called American plants. On the arches and ceiling of the chapel, you can find clear and detailed images of corn, maize, ears, and aloe or agave leaves. These plants, as is known to official science, were brought to Europe only after Christopher Columbus's voyages at the end of the 15th century. That is, after the chapel was built. How could the carvers have known what they looked like? This anomaly gave rise to a bold hypothesis. The fugitive Templars did not simply disappear on their ships, but made a transatlantic voyage long before Columbus reached the shores of America, and then their descendants, in the form of the Sinclair clan, encrypted their knowledge of these lands in the stone of Rosslyn Chapel. According to ancient legends, there is a sealed crypt, or an entire system of underground passages beneath the chapel itself. Legend has it that it is there, in lead coffins untouched by time, that the Templars' greatest treasures are kept. Not gold, but their secret knowledge, archives, sacred relics such as the Holy Grail, or even the head of John the Baptist himself. Numerous attempts to conduct serious research using ground-penetrating radar or to begin excavations have been met with resistance from the chapel's trustees, who cite the fragility of the building and the need to respect the sacred site. Thus, Rosslyn Chapel remains one of the greatest historical mysteries. Is it simply a bizarre masterpiece of Gothic architecture? Or something more? A stone library of secret knowledge? A map to a treasure trove? Or even the reliquary itself, patiently waiting for its moment to shine? Beyond sea roots and Scottish mists, there is another, perhaps the most daring and striking theory about the fate of the Templars' legacy. This hypothesis takes us to the heart of Europe, to the Alpine valleys, where at the same time that the Order of the Temple was dying under the blows of the French king, a new state, unique in the medieval world, was being born: the Swiss Confederation. At first glance, there seems to be nothing in common between poor shepherds and a powerful order of knights. But if you look closely at the chronology and some striking coincidences, an intriguing picture emerges. The official date of Switzerland's birth is considered to be August 1st, 1291, when three forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, formed the Eternal Alliance for joint defense against the Austrian Habsburgs. However, for many years, this alliance remained fragile and local. The true birth of Swiss independence and its military phenomenon occurred at the beginning of the 14th century, in tandem with the tragedy of the Knights Templar. On November 15th, 1315, just 1 year after the burning of Jacques de Molay, the legendary Battle of Morgarten took place. A small, poorly armed detachment of Swiss peasants and townspeople, numbering about 1,500, faced the well-equipped professional army of the Austrian Duke Leopold I, consisting of several thousand knights and infantrymen. The outcome of the battle seemed a foregone conclusion. But then, the incredible happened. The Swiss lured the heavy cavalry into a narrow gorge between a mountain and a lake, then rained down a hail of stones, logs, and their famous halberds. In the narrow passage, the knights were unable to turn around. Panic ensued, and the battle turned into a massacre. The Austrian army was completely defeated. This victory was so unusual for its time that it raised many questions among historians. How could simple shepherds devise and flawlessly execute such a complex tactical plan requiring iron discipline and coordination? The theory is that they had help. Behind the Swiss militia stood experienced military instructors, fugitive Knights Templar who had found refuge in the remote alpine valleys, veterans of hundreds of battles, masters of fortification and tactics. They brought with them invaluable combat experience. For them, accustomed to fighting superior Saracen forces in the gorges of the Holy Land, ambush tactics were second nature. But military assistance is only one side of the coin. Even more striking are the parallels in the financial sphere. The Order of the Knights Templar was not just a military force, it was the first transnational corporation, the creator of an international banking system based on reliability, security, and confidentiality. And now, after the destruction of the Order, it is Switzerland that has gradually, over the centuries, become a global financial center, whose name has become synonymous with banking secrecy, political neutrality, and a safe haven for capital from around the world. Is this just a coincidence? Or did the surviving Templars, perhaps financial geniuses from the Parisian Temple, manage to escape with some of their assets and, more importantly, their invaluable knowledge, laying the foundations for the future Swiss banking system? They did not bring chests of gold with them, but something much more valuable: an idea, a system, and a reputation. There are also symbolic hints, although they are more controversial. The Swiss national flag is a white equilateral cross on a red background. The Templars' battle standard, their famous Bossion, was a red cross on a white and black or simply white background. In fact, the Swiss flag is a color inversion of the Templar flag. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in the context of all the other coincidences, it makes you wonder. This theory suggests that the true treasure of the Knights Templar was not material wealth, but their organizational structure, their principles, and their knowledge. They did not simply hide their gold, they invested it, along with their experience, in a new and bold social and political project. They helped create a state based on the principles of independence, security, and financial stability, the very pillars on which the greatness of the order itself was built. If previous theories led us on the trail of the Templars in the Old World to Portugal, Scotland, and Switzerland, the fourth, most fantastic, and most modern version takes us across the Atlantic Ocean to a small, unremarkable island off the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada. The name of this island is Oak Island. It is here, on this patch of land covering just 140 acres, that the longest, most expensive, and deadliest treasure hunt in human history has been unfolding for over 200 years. And at the center of this drama is the legendary treasure of the Knights Templar. The story began in 1795, when 3 teenagers walking around the island noticed a strange depression in the ground, over which hung a stump of an old oak tree with traces of a rope block. Deciding that they had stumbled upon a pirate's treasure, the boys began to dig. Every 10 feet, about 3 meters, they came across a platform made of oak logs. It was clearly an artificial structure. They continued digging, but soon realized that the 3 of them couldn't handle it. Thus began an obsession that consumed dozens of companies, hundreds of investors, and has already cost 6 people their lives. Legend has it that the 7th must die before the island reveals its secret. What subsequent generations of treasure hunters discovered was mind-boggling. The mine, dubbed the Money Pit, turned out to be an incredibly complex engineering structure. At a depth of 90 feet, 27 meters, a stone slab with mysterious symbols was found. Although the slab itself has long been lost, its supposed translation reads, "2 million pounds sterling are buried 40 feet underground." But the main trick was yet to come. The mine was protected by an ingenious system of water tunnels connected to the ocean. Any attempt to dig down to the supposed treasure trove resulted in the mine being instantly flooded with seawater. Creating such a hydraulic system in the wild conditions of the 18th century was practically impossible. It required knowledge, resources, and engineering genius that the pirates did not have. So who could have built it? At first glance, the connection with the Templars seems far-fetched. But proponents of this theory have pieced together a whole chain of circumstantial evidence. First, the very name New Scotland refers to the Scottish heritage and the Sinclair clan. The legendary Prince Henry Sinclair, a descendant of the Templars' patrons, according to some versions, sailed to America at the end of the 14th century, almost a century before Columbus. Was he the one who founded a secret refuge for the Order's legacy? Secondly, artifacts have been found on the island itself and in its vicinity that do not fit into the official history. These include coconut fibers used for filtration in water tunnels. Coconuts do not grow in Canada. Scraps of parchment. And most importantly, a lead cross of a distinctive shape, very similar to the symbols used by the Templars. Thirdly, the very complexity of the Money Pit and its defense systems points to builders with vast experience in fortification and engineering, such as the Templars, who built hundreds of castles throughout Europe and the Middle East. The Oak Island theory suggests that the treasures taken from La Rochelle did not remain in Europe, but were transported across the ocean to a pre-prepared, most secure repository in the world. It was not just a hiding place, but a real engineering puzzle, created to keep the secret for centuries. Of course, skeptics argue that the whole story of the Money Pit is either a natural phenomenon, a karst sinkhole, or the greatest hoax of all time. Many artifacts could have been planted, and the deciphering of the stone slab is considered fiction. Nevertheless, in the 21st century, modern treasure hunters, the Lagina brothers, heroes of a popular TV show, using the latest technology, discovered traces of human activity on the island dating back to pre-Columbian times, as well as numerous underground anomalies. Oak Island is a modern myth that grew out of a medieval legend. It is a place where a historical mystery has turned into a reality show, and belief in treasure has become more powerful than any scientific argument. Perhaps the Templars' treasure really is hidden beneath layers of clay and water. Or perhaps the island's greatest treasure is the mystery itself, which for centuries has drawn people obsessed with the dream of touching the greatest mystery in history. While treasure hunters dig up Oak Island and historians study maps, The most important thing is slipping away in the pursuit of phantom gold. What if the true treasure of the Templars is not chests of coins, but the intangible legacy they left behind? What if their main assets are the ideas, knowledge, and principles that survived the destruction of the Order and continue to influence our world to this day? This legacy can be divided into two parts, the real and the mythical, and at times they are so closely intertwined that it is almost impossible to separate one from the other. The real legacy is undeniable and enormous. First, there is the financial revolution. The Templars, as we have already mentioned, created the world's first international banking system. Their travelers' checks, property-backed lending system, and asset management laid the foundation for modern banking. They proved that the main capital in finance is not gold, but trust. Their reputation was impeccable, and it was on this reputation that their power was built. And although the Order was destroyed, the idea itself did not die. The principles of secure capital transfer, deposit confidentiality, and lender reliability were first adopted and developed by Italian banking houses, and then, according to one theory, by the Swiss banking system. Secondly, there is the legacy in architecture and logistics. The castles that the Templars built in the Middle East, such as the famous Crac des Chevaliers, although it was originally a hospital, the Templars built similar fortresses, were the pinnacle of fortification art. They were the first to use a system of concentric walls on a large scale, creating virtually impregnable citadels. Their network of commanderies throughout Europe was a logistical marvel, allowing them to efficiently manage a giant corporation and quickly move resources. But it is the mythical legacy of the Order that excites the imagination even more. After 1314, the Templars did not disappear completely. They went underground and became a legend. And this legend became a breeding ground for the emergence and development of many secret societies. The most famous and direct connection can be traced to Freemasonry. Many Masonic statutes and degrees of higher initiation, especially in the so-called Scottish Rite, trace their history directly back to the fugitive Knights Templar. The degree of Knight Kadosh, or Knight Templar, is the culmination of many Masonic systems. Legend has it that the surviving Templars, who found refuge in Scotland, preserved their secret rituals and esoteric knowledge, which they then passed on to the medieval guilds of stonemasons, Freemasons, from which modern Freemasonry grew. It is in Masonic symbolism that we find a direct continuation of the Templar legacy. The sword, the skull and bones, and, of course, the image of the knight seeking light and truth. What is this secret knowledge? Here the myth becomes even thicker. It is believed that during their 200 years in the Middle East, the Templars came into contact not only with Islamic science and philosophy, but also with more ancient, esoteric teachings, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and possibly even the legacy of the Eye, ancient Egyptian priests. It is said that their true treasure was not the material Holy Grail, the cup containing the blood of Christ, but the spiritual Grail, a secret teaching about the nature of God and man, which the Catholic Church considered heresy. Thus, the destruction of the Order led to a paradoxical result. By destroying the physical shell, Philip the Fair made the legend of the Templars immortal. Their real achievements in finance and military affairs became part of world history, and their supposed secrets and mystical knowledge spread around the world, giving rise to new myths and secret societies. Perhaps this was their master plan, to create a legacy that could not be stolen, burned at the stake, or confiscated. A legacy that lives on in ideas. And so we come to the end of our long journey. 7 centuries have passed since the smoke from the bonfire on the Ile de la Cité drifted over Paris. Eras have changed, empires have collapsed, and the world has changed beyond recognition. We live in an age of satellite images, ground-penetrating radar, and genetic analysis that reveals the secrets of the past. And yet, the main mystery of the Knights Templar, the secret of their missing treasure, remains as unsolvable and exciting as it was in 1314. We have gone through a maze of versions and hypotheses, each of which is logical in its own way and unprovable in its own way. What was it? A fleet of 18 ships that secretly left La Rochelle and vanished into the ocean? Knowledge encrypted in the stone forest of Rosslyn Chapel? Organizational genius and capital that became the foundation for the banking system of an entire nation in the heart of the Alps? Or a brilliant and deadly engineering trap on a remote island in the New World? Each of these paths leads us to a dead end, breaking off mid-sentence and leaving behind more questions than answers. This is the phenomenal longevity of the legend of the Templar treasure. It is multifaceted. For some, it is a classic story of pirate gold, chests of coins and jewels. For others, it is a search for sacred Christian relics, such as the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant. For others, it is a conspiracy theory about a secret society that has survived and still invisibly rules the world. And for others, it is a metaphysical quest for lost sacred knowledge that could change humanity. This mystery is a perfect mirror in which everyone sees a reflection of their own hopes, fears, and aspirations. Perhaps, in 7 centuries of searching, we have missed the point. Perhaps we are looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place. What if Grand Master Jacques de Molay, as he walked to the stake, laughed at his executioners not because he had hidden the gold, but because he had created something far more valuable and lasting? He created an immortal myth, a myth about unjustly condemned heroes, about fallen greatness, about a secret more precious than any treasure. Ultimately, the history of the Knights Templar is a tragedy about the clash of two worlds: the old world of chivalry, based on faith and honor, and the new world of the state, based on cynical calculation and the law of the strong. In this clash, the knights lost the battle but, paradoxically, won the war for immortality in the memory of generations. Their treasure is the story itself, which has inspired hundreds of books, films, and studies. It is a mystery that compels us to look back into the past again and again, trying to understand not only what happened, but also what could have happened. Most likely, we will never get a definitive answer. No document or artifact ever found will be able to put an end to this story, because any discovery will only raise new questions. Jacques de Molay's chests, wherever they may be, will remain locked forever. And in this silence of history, in this eternal unspoken mystery, lies the main legacy and greatest treasure of the Knights Templar, a mystery that is destined to remain unsolved.